everybody who's here already. Welcome to another session on Aucademy, where we are today discussing being autistic in other cultures. Are you still autistic, basically? And LARPing, which we're going to get into. What even is that acronym and what does that mean? I am Dr. Chloe Farahar. I am a white person with a shaved head and giant glasses, and you will recognise one of my favourite jumpers, which is my yellow jumper with a sort of laying down potato that says current mood potato by one of my favourite cartoonists or illustrators on Instagram. And today I am joined by Monique Craine, if you wouldn't mind doing a brief physical description of yourself.
Hiya. So I'm Monique Craine. I'm a white person, kind of middle-aged, whiting hair, wearing a black polo neck.
And a lovely headset and a pair of glasses as well. We forget things.
Sorry.
I know, we forget things all the time about what's even on our faces and things like that, which I always find quite amusing when it comes to doing a physical description. So before we actually jump into the whole who are you, what do you do, etc., etc., I think it is worth just saying very briefly what is LARPing, or at least what it stands for, just so people know what we're talking about today. So we're talking about kind of largely, we're going to talk about being autistic in other cultures, but also touching on LARPing at the end.
So LARPing, it stands for live action role playing. So you get all different kinds of LARPing, from fantasy through to Viking, reenactment, all kinds of things. I used to do the fantasy live action role playing.
Fantastic, and we'll talk about that a bit more, because I do find it very interesting actually, and it's again, it goes back to all sorts of stereotypes that potentially autistic people may be more likely to do things like LARPing. And Dungeons and Dragons and all sorts of things. I've only ever played one or had one attempt at, and it wasn't even Dungeons and Dragons, it was like a version of. It was with one of our professors. It was quite awkward because they were like the guide and things, and it was a little bit awkward because I was a student and I was like, this is strange. And my partner came as well. So we'll definitely talk about those sorts of things. So we're going to start with our nice basic questions, which are, who are you? And what is or are your dedicated interests?
Okay, so Monique Craine. I'm from Gibraltar. I've lived in the UK for quite a lot of my life, but I've lived in a number of different countries. My interests are obviously LARPing, which we'll talk about later, and autism and neurodiversity generally. So I look at all the different neurodivergent conditions, and that's because I'm myself multiply neurodivergent. So I'm autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic, and have a few attention differences, shall we say.
So Annette, that's how I describe Annette. She's autistic, dyslexic, dyspraxic with attention differences. She's like all the things.
Fantastic. I think they kind of balance each other out, actually.
But yes, potentially. So what do you tend to do? Because you do a bit of everything, don't you? You're educator
I at the moment, my focus is training in workplaces. So I do a lot of neurodiversity training in workplaces. So I have large companies, usually through the unions. They bring me in to deliver training, and I cover, like I say, everything that is neurodiversity. So, I talk about all the different neurodivergent presentations, and then hone in. So I specialize quite a lot in autism, but I think that's because there's a lot people don't understand about autism. So that's what my focus is at the moment. But I also do a lot of coaching for autistic people as well. So, and otherwise neurodivergent. So things like teaching life skills. So I had to put my hands in the air and say, I was 40 before I learned to clean my house. Okay. It was never dirty, but it was definitely never clean. So, there were things that I had to teach myself how to do, because I realized no one's actually told me how to do these things, even though, my mother still is. She has a remarkably clean house all the time, and she could come around and clean my house in minutes, and I'd still be there in the kitchen, still doing the same plate, going, what do you mean you've done the whole house? You know, I was so challenged at doing day-to-day tasks. So I had to teach myself. And I guess what I do now is when I get groups of, especially when they're newly diagnosed. So we cover a lot of things like what is sensory inputs. You know, why do we have different sensory profiles? And why do we stim? You know, because that's related to our sensory profiles. And then I look at things like relaxation as well. Because where I'm talking to neurotypical people mainly, because there are always a few people on the courses that go, oh, you know what, I think I might be, or, you know, well, I was diagnosed as a kid or whatever. But the majority of them are neurotypical. So my aim is to teach them to understand autistic behavior better, so that they, you know, if they see the grimace face, they don't assume anger, they assume confusion, because we seem to understand each other, you know, quite well. We you know, when people are stimming and stuff, we know that what it's a sign of. But neurotypical people, I think generally, because our behaviors aren't typical for them, they misconstrue them, and they think, oh, well, that scrunched up face, that means anger, and the fact that they're rocking, you know, they might become violent or something. And it's like trying to explain to them, actually, these are all normal behaviors, and they're a reaction to our environment and to the stimulus that is going in, and they're a way of grounding us. So it's about teaching those kind of things. So I love doing the sessions for people who are newly diagnosed, because they're like, I never realized. And I stop myself from doing all these things because people think, you know, I've been told, oh, that's awkward when you do that. Or, you know, you distract people with the noise you make with your legs shaking all the time. So they try to suppress these things. And then they wonder why their mental health isn't going so well. And it's like trying to just let people realize that actually these behaviors are normal. They do benefit us. So really, it's about kind of interpreting autistic behavior, I think. So that's what I do.
And this is a thing, and this is because hopefully, because we're doing next week, we're doing one of our first ever Aucademy sessions on sensory and touching on stimming, because I've waited until Annette had finished and been ready after her PhD. So we're going to be doing that. And so you're still invited to that if you're interested in coming next Saturday. So yeah. little spoiler, if you like, for next week. So basically we'll be talking about sensory, we'll be talking about stimming, and the things that you just mentioned. So yeah, we've got a couple of sessions actually specifically around sensory and stimming, but that's not what we're talking about today.
It's not. It's not.
So our next key question that we ask people is, when were you discovered as autistic or otherwise neurodivergent?
Well, I should have been identified at school because I presented quite classically. I struggled with so many different things, but I think because there were a couple of factors working against me. So first of all, because I was female, they didn't pick up on the cues quite as well as they would have if I had been male, I think. But also because my parents spoke a different language at home. So things like dyslexia, the teachers when I was little, they put it down to the fact that my parents spoke a foreign language, and that must be confusing to me. You know, the fact that my brother was 2 years older and he was a whiz at English, you know, he had no problems at all, didn't give them the clue. But, you know, my parents in the end, they stopped speaking. They said, you know, we'll speak English only, so that you don't struggle as much. And ultimately, you know, it was because I was dyslexic. So I left school with hardly any qualifications because they said that, you know, I was not able. They called me a less able student. And, you know, they said that I would never, ever be able to pass an O-level, as it was. I'm showing my age there. GCSEs nowadays. But they said I'd never be able to pass an O-level. So it wasn't till I was 26. And at the time, I thought I'd had a nervous breakdown. Now I realized it was just a massive meltdown, that things had just become too much. And, you know, I was so overwhelmed by everything that I started kind of seeking help. And I ended up going back to university. I went back to college, got A levels, went on to university, and it was during my second year of university. I was also pregnant. I had my daughter during my second year of uni, and I just got to the point. I guess I was so stressed because I was pregnant. I was worried that I wouldn't be able to finish and things once the baby came, and that stress impacted my dyslexia, to the point where I couldn't read simple words. So I remember I was sat there with a newspaper, trying to read an article that was relevant for a study I was doing, and I got stuck on this three-letter word, WHO, and I was there, whoa, 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 whoa. I couldn't work. I threw the paper across the room, and I went down to student services the next day and said, I'm quitting. Massive imposter syndrome. I should have never been here. The teachers were right. I'm not bright enough. I can't even keep up with the reading. And they said, well, if you don't mind, before you quit, can we just send you to someone, just for screening? And, they asked a couple of questions, not very much, and then said, do you mind if we get a psychologist, an educational psychologist in to check if you're dyslexic? And first of all, I said, no, I don't want that. And people say to me, is that because of the stigma? And I think, no, it's because I spent my whole life telling myself, you're probably dyslexic. That's why you can't do these things. And if I go for this test and they tell me I'm not dyslexic, well, what then? Then I'll really have to just face up the shame that I can't read like other people. And I can't, so there was a little bit of a hurdle there. But in the end, I said, yeah, okay, go for it. And yes, it turns out I'm moderately to severely dyslexic. And at the time, they told me that that also accounted for my clumsiness and my social difficulties, and everything was clumped under the dyslexia. So, the more I looked into it, the more I thought, well, that doesn't actually account for all these things that I'm experiencing. I thought it was a broken version of a neurotypical. And it was about 20 years later that I found information on the internet about neurodiversity. And it was like this new word that I just thought, wow, that actually explains so much more. Is it possible that I have these other things going on as well, and it's not just dyslexia? So I was 42 when I was diagnosed with dyspraxia, and then 44 when I finally had my autism assessment. So it's been a very long journey, but the only reason we discovered about autism was because one of my children, I thought they might be dyspraxic because they had a few difficulties that similar to my own, but they got put straight on the autism assessment pathway, and then it came back, yes, they have, very pronounced, they said, very pronounced autism. And that was the first time that word really came into our household. And the funny thing is that, all these years later, we've found out my entire family, my husband's autistic as well. I'm autistic. The kids are autistic. So it's actually, we live in this little autistic bubble in our house. But to think for like 40 years, I just thought I was a broken neurotypical.
And that in itself, just that phrase, isn't it? That just sums up so many people's lives and experiences, is that feeling that you're a broken neurotypical, as opposed to a perfectly lovely autistic person. And I think regardless of, because I'm thinking it's not just us that are later discovered, it's also young children that maybe aren't explained. It's not explained to them that they're autistic. Or if it is, it's not explained in a lot of detail, or in a good way. So they have this idea that they're a broken neurotypical. Whereas, not focusing on the individual's personal strengths and things. And Victoria sounds familiar. So Victoria, I think,
So for about 15 years, I was medicated. And the doctors were telling me it's depression. And I was saying, but I'm not depressed. I'm frustrated. I don't understand. And I can't make and keep friends. And, I keep getting things wrong. It's not depression. But I was still, medicated for like 15 years for depression. It was a real moment of clarity, I'd say, when we finally realized, and it life-changing. And I think I've learned so much from my children as well, because when you're older and you're diagnosed, you don't really realize the extent of how much you've been masking, especially someone like me who loves to act. So I literally, when I went to job interviews and stuff, I'd look at my husband and I say, am I wearing the right costume? Because it wasn't, it was, I have to play the part. So it's down to, I'd even buy new clothes to fit the part that I was going to play. And it's only when I looked at my children that I think, well, actually, I was like that. That's exactly how I used to be. Why have I stopped being like that? And it helps you kind of self-reflect a lot as well.
And I think I've seen Victoria's also saying same there as well. So I feel like Victoria is really feeling a deep connection potentially with or similarity with your discovery journey. So thank you very much. So let's get on to the meaty topic itself, which is being autistic in other cultures. And I find this really interesting because Monique and I have already had a chat, obviously, to talk about what Monique was going to cover. But I do find this interesting, particularly if anybody's ever had the misfortune of looking at the diagnostic manual, for instance. It's really interesting because for the majority of anything that's classed as a disorder, in quotation marks, throughout the DSMs, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, there's always a little caveat somewhere about dependent on cultural norms. Now, that doesn't make sense. If we're talking about which we're not, if we were able to talk about a measurable thing that we're calling a disorder, it will be the same everywhere,
regardless,
because we're talking about biology. And this is just demonstrating the much more complex understanding of what it means to be autistic. So there is going to be some biology there. We don't know what. So I'm not saying it's just this made up thing, but it's certainly not how it's depicted in the manuals. And like I say, so I do find it really interesting because and frustrating, because it's like dependent on cultural norms, i.e. eye contact. Dependent on cultural norms. You would not necessarily be classed as having a symptom, in quotation marks, of autism in certain cultures.
Yeah.
So do you want to, anything about what I've just said?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's not just me that's lived in a few countries. My husband grew up for his teen years in Hong Kong. And he was saying that there, they have such a rules-based culture that he actually found things much easier because everything was, this is the right way to do things. This is how you're meant to do things. And, there's less emphasis on eye contact. It's seen as rude to stare at someone when you're talking, if they're, older than you or in a position of power or something. So it's, in that sense, he was saying that he found it much easier to fit in there. With myself, I know that, my tendency to talk over people, because I do have a tendency to leap in and go, oh, yeah. And I had this and, and that's a big problem here in the UK. You're meant to know your place. You're meant to wait your turn.
Difference is enthusiasm. That's
what
it
is. I'm just showing enthusiasm and I'm joining in. But in Spain, that aspect wasn't a problem. So that it is a case of, I'm still the same autistic person, but depending on where I live, different aspects of the way I behave are problematic to them. So I think that's the where the cultural norms comes in, because I think we're kind of the same, but depending on where you are and depending on the cultural norms around you will depend on whether they think that your eye contact's inappropriate or your play is inappropriate or your inattention or your interrupting. All those kind of things are cultural. It's not actually written in stone that someone needs to be able to finish a sentence before the next person takes their turn. you know, we're not playing a game. It's not, it goes round to the left and, you know, you have to take your turn in the right place. It totally depends on the culture around you as to whether you feel at home being able to jump in and say things, or whether you feel, you know, I can't. And I think the biggest thing for me was the way people greet. The way people greet and meet each other. So in Spain, you know, it's quite common to hug someone and kiss both cheeks. When I lived in Malta, I noticed you do the hug, you only kiss the one cheek. In fact, you kiss off to the side rather than actually kissing the cheek. But then coming back here to the UK, and suddenly I found I didn't know how to interact with people, because you don't know who's going to shake your hand, who's going to try and hug you, who's going to pat you on the shoulder. The greetings are completely...
It's not standardised.
It's not standardised.
Britain.
That's it.
Which is rude, because and that was really interesting about, so like you say, your husband out in Hong Kong felt, because the rules are much more explicit. Yeah. So there's none of this hidden meaning and trying to work this stuff out that you have in some other cultures. So certainly in England, that is a frustrating thing for autistic people, that where's this manual that everyone else seems to have to be able to work all these things out? And like say,
and why does it change? Why does it change? Why is it okay with some people and not with other people?
Yes, I want the standardization. I want to know, because when we had this discussion to check in with each other about the session, because when you said to me, you know, in Spain or in Malta, you hug and you kiss off to the side of one cheek, and my instant response is like, because I don't want to do that. But you were saying, but at least you knew.
You know, like, exactly what's coming and exactly what's expected.
Cognitively can prepare yourself for that situation. Whereas, like I say, in the UK, I have no idea. I don't know what's going on. Yeah. Are we shaking? Are we this? I mean, to be fair, everybody just gets an awkward wave from me. I just go, sorry, I don't shake hands, awkward wave.
And the thing is, you know, here, it's like you have to tell people, I don't like to hug. So like I say, in Spain, I had no problem, because it's very brief. You know, the greeting is done like this and it's universal. But here, it's only some people that do it. So it takes me by surprise and I don't like it. And sometimes, you know, people don't then know how to treat you. So I've gone into rooms where people have been like shaking hands with everyone and then hugging all the women that come in. And then they've seen me and kind of gone like this and then patted me, because they don't know how to react. So it's like, there's no standardized greeting. There's no standardized behavior that's actually the right way to do things by our culture. It's very dependent on individuals. And I can never tell. I can't read someone to know what kind of greeting they're going to do. So I always say, look, if you've always hugged me, carry on greeting me by a hug, because otherwise I'm going to think I've done something. Otherwise I'm going to think there's something wrong, and I'm going to think it must be me. What have I done this time? And then I'll start acting strange, and then, you know, there will be tension. But ultimately, it's if you know what's coming. So in some places, even though I'm not someone who likes to hug people at all, you know, I found it much easier to live somewhere. The pandemic has simplified greeting. I was saying the other day that the best thing for me about the pandemic is that you see someone coming across the road and it's okay now to cross the road and not have to talk to them. Whereas before that would have been seen completely rude. But I really do struggle with greetings and small talk.
I still would have done that before the pandemic. I don't care anymore.
So it's making things standardized would be so much easier.
So we've got, size elbows, or just the Vulcan sign should be mandatory. Yep. And then we've got Victoria, unstandardized awkwardness. We need standardized.
That's bang on.
And I want to give my little anecdote, which is So most people, as soon as I knew I was autistic, I pretty much told everybody to try and explain who I am to people. And my original first supervisor for my PhD is American. And I remember during my master's, so before I started my PhD, she was still my supervisor at that point. And she came in and she saw me while I was still working part-time somewhere. And I hadn't seen her for a little while. So she came over and she hugged me in my workplace. Now, that's really bizarre, right? Sorry, Rachel, if you ever watch this. That's really bizarre because one, why would I hug my professor? That's very strange. And two, it was in my workplace, so it wasn't even in the setting that I would normally see that person, and it was just very uncomfortable for me. So I was kind of like patting like this on the back, right? So I knew that she was a hugger. So she's American. So I just figured, right, is that an American thing? Is that just that person thing?
Yeah.
And then when I did start my PhD, she actually had the opportunity to finally live in the same country as her husband, which they hadn't been able to do for a while because I think he's a doctor. So they moved to Canada. And then when she came back for a visit, I was picking her up. So it was planned. I was picking her up from the train station so that
all
I could
prepped.
take her up to campus and say hello and catch up with everybody because she'd not been in the country for a while. So in my head, I'm like, right, she's a hugger. Right. Okay. Mentally preparing myself for days, knowing that I should be hugging this person because I don't like hugging. But I thought, right, I'll do this. She's a hugger and I haven't seen her for a while. And actually, I really, really respected her. She was fantastic, actually. One of the first people I told that I was autistic before I got my diagnosis. I get out my car and in my head, I'm mentally preparing for the hug. And she comes over and she's rushing and she's got her bag and she's like, oh, a bit late, blah, blah, blah. We've got to get up should have been here earlier, blah, blah. And I go to hug her and she's like, there's no time. Let's get in the car. And I just felt absolutely crushed because I was like, I have mentally prepared for this for days.
Yeah.
Right. And you've just take it. And I did tell her, I think at one point, and she felt really bad because she didn't think about it. It would not have crossed her mind, right? But for me, it was days of preparing for that activity for it to just be taken away.
That's it. And if we do prepare,
people.
But that's it. If we do prepare and we know what's coming, then most of us can handle it. But unprepared, it's like I meet people and I just don't know what to do. So when it's business, it's nice and easy because it's a standardized handshake most of the time. But there's still huggers there as well. So it is just one of those, I just wish people would tell me in advance.
Sigh, no. Because I don't do hugging. But it is funny. So it's really, really fascinating. So I want to come back to things about, so like Hong Kong. Somebody's also, I think it might have been even Side, that mentioned about, where was it? It was about eye contact in Japan. So Sai's saying, I've often wondered how the diagnostic process, for instance, works in Japan. I do actually have, I've had a small number of Japanese, thanks for that, Sai. I've had a small number, sorry, just in the comment section. I have a small number, or I have had a small number of Japanese autistic students. And there's a lot of other things in play here because the stigma is very also different in different cultures.
Absolutely.
I would argue being autistic is stigmatized everywhere.
Yeah.
But the stigma is different dependent on the culture as well, which is not necessarily something we can go into. I don't know whether you have any more understanding of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about it more anecdotally because I've supported a number of autistic students, which means they're all from all over the place. So I've had Japanese autistic students, Indian autistic students, so you can see the stigma plays out in different ways.
Absolutely. And you can tell as well by the amount of advocates and people that talk on autism. We have a real lack of representation from certain communities. So you have to wonder, are they not getting diagnosed, or what's going on there? Because there's definitely autistic people within those cultures, but is it the stigma that's stopping the parents from getting them diagnosed, or is there something else at play as well? So, and it's usually it's multifaceted. There's usually a number of factors. But yeah, it is very much. I get a lot of families who are telling me, oh, in our culture, you just don't say these things. Nothing wrong here, nothing to see, and that they try to hide the children to a certain extent. So it is, and then as the children grow, I guess that that they've adjusted to the culture. But yeah, it is. It's an area that needs quite a lot of study and a lot more advocacy. We need to be reaching the Black and ethnic minorities a lot more than we do.
And then that's still one of my. I will keep asking. I will ask. As many autistic people from different ethnicities and cultures as possible. But it is difficult. Not from my perspective. I don't mean, I'm not putting that on those groups. What I mean is finding them, and also, I guess, making a space and a platform that is safe for them as well. Because again, I wouldn't necessarily ask. I would ask, but I wouldn't necessarily expect, for instance, some of the autistic students that I've supported from those different cultural backgrounds, I know a small number of them would not feel safe because they wouldn't want to be openly autistic on a public platform. And this goes across, like, say, the different cultures. I'm not speaking about any one particular student here, actually. I'm speaking about a number, so I'm being very more generalised. I've known a small number of them from different cultures. Similar things do happen in the UK, but it seems to happen a lot more in other cultures where they have actually been diagnosed as children.
Yeah.
And because of the stigma around disability and mental health and neurodevelopmental difference, it's just not talked about. You don't talk about it. You basically can't be disabled, and that means incredibly heavy masking, a lot of internalized stigma and ableism, which is incredibly sad and difficult. So I'm always very pleased, actually, that they get the opportunity to be international students and realize that they're autistic and get to come to our spaces. But it's certainly, it is a struggle to try and make those, because I can make this space as safe as possible. That doesn't change the fact that they might still not be able to come here because of being publicly, their family might see them, that kind of thing.
That's it. And it's not just the family, it's the employers. The stigma is, and like you say, we're stigmatized in all countries, but in different ways. So there are some cultures where it's very much, nothing to see here. The child is just normal. He just doesn't like to go out much. We're just not going to pay attention to that. And then there's other cultures where it's much more acceptable to say that you're autistic. So we're very lucky that we can be. I find myself. I think of it as I'm very privileged. I'm a privileged autistic. So even though there's a lot of discrimination against all autistics, I think I've been very privileged because I do have the ability to stand up and say, I'm autistic, and I can stim in public to some extent. And, with other cultures, with other ethnicities, there's not that safety.
And also, particularly if you're very male, masculine presenting, for instance, as well, that there's so many things, because there's a lot of the time, then not a lot of the time, that's not fair. Sometimes there's that thing of, there's too much talk about autistic boys and autistic men, but actually, there are some things that need talking about, which is sometimes it's not safe for them to be openly autistic. And so we should be talking definitely about all.
And it's not even openly autistic. It's like I was saying before, if an autistic man, okay, let's say a 6 foot tall, burly man, gets confused by the language someone's using because they're being vague and flowery, and they're kind of, I don't understand what you're saying. They pull that face of confusion. Well, a 6 foot burly man, people feel intimidated. They feel scared. And it's, well, that's their problem because they're misinterpreting the facial expression. But ultimately, it means that that man isn't safe to react that way, and they have to suppress a lot more, and they're going to be less able to join in things and take part in things because they're more conscious that, you know, they can be misinterpreted very easily. And, you know, if you're accused of aggression or violence or anything like that, you know, it's you just don't want to go down that road. So it's, you know, and obviously if you're a big 6 foot burly man and black, you know, there's a lot of fear that people might overreact, that they might, you know, label you or even call the police on you just because you're stimming a bit, and, you know, that's suspicious. So for years, I used to smoke. And whenever I went to places, I'd have like 3 cigarettes outside before I went in, not because I wanted to smoke, but because that's the only safe stim. To me, that was the only way I could take myself away from the crowd. So as soon as there was a break, I'd go outside to smoke because it got me away from everyone and I was allowed to pace up and down while smoking a cigarette. But if I wasn't smoking, that same behaviour could have been seen as suspicious.
The pacing particularly, yeah. And very sadly, again, with a number of different black male students, it is lovely to have them there in our spaces, in our student spaces, because they tell us about how the way they talk is always perceived as aggressive and things like this. And we can see why, in the sense of how their tone and things like that, but it's not perceived that way. We understand where the confusion is coming from non-autistic, particularly, obviously, it will be white people predominantly. So we can see where the confusion is, but they get to be in a space where we don't see it in that way. And it's just how do we keep those sorts of spaces? We need more of those sorts of spaces. And
we do. We do. And I think that if we had, because we're like 1 in 100, maybe 1 in 50, but we're definitely nowhere near a majority anywhere. So when you look at the geographical spread, you know, we're minorities everywhere. So some people can grow up their whole life not meeting another openly autistic person. And I think if we actually had a space that was just loads, you know, all autistic people, if we lived in like a commune or something, would develop our own language as well.
How many of those conversations have you had with your autistic friends and family about Autopia? We have these conversations all the time.
Yeah. Because, you know, I think we'd develop different language and stuff as well. Because, you know that, like, I think it's Eskimos have something like 120 different words to describe snow, because they have so many different varieties of it. We just say snow or sleet or heavy snow, you know. But I think if we had those spaces, then we'd have so many different words to describe our emotions. Because I think we feel emotions differently to neurotypical people. So they want us to be either happy or sad or, you know, these standardized emotions. And I think ours are so much more complex and sometimes so much deeper that we'd probably develop new words to express the exact, you know, happy but excited and a little bit nervous and quite angry about certain things. You know, we'd find a word for that. But we live we're minorities. We're not surrounded by people who experience the world the same way as us. So we're limited to their language and their expressions. And yeah, it's limiting, I think.
And Victoria's point as well, which is emotions don't have to have words. And I've written about this actually, which is that we do communicate in lots of non-word based ways, how we're doing, how we're feeling, etc. I just want to come back to the thing of being autistic in Japan, for instance, and what interests me about that is that, again, knowing Japanese autistic people and how difficult it actually is, family-wise, work-wise, to be openly disabled or openly autistic, and or both. But then also knowing, which would have been a non-Japanese person, so I think potentially they were American. But it was quite a few years back, and I was reading just lots of blogs and things like this, and I saw a little anecdote by somebody who said they'd always felt that they were inherently disabled, as in not talking in they were not against, but they didn't feel they met that social model of disability. They felt they were inherently disabled by being autistic, or for them, being autistic was the disability in and of itself, until they went to Japan. So this was the anecdote. And it was when they went to Japan and they realised for the first time, it wasn't them that was the disabling element. It was their environment. Because of the Japanese culture being so different, you're not expected to hug, for instance, or even shake hands. It's potentially bowing, or eye contact isn't expected. And they were talking about how a lot of the public places were much quieter and tidy and clean because of cultural norms, and that was the first time they ever felt that it wasn't them that was inherently disabled. So obviously I'm not trying to dismiss that actually it's very difficult for Japanese autistic people. So I'm not talking about that culture specifically, I guess, but it's just this idea that we might not feel or consider ourselves to be disabled in certain cultures.
Yeah. And another thing my husband said about growing up in China was that there it's a very strength-based education. So whereas here in the UK, because I couldn't write like other kids and my spelling was and still is absolutely appalling, there was this assumption that we have to concentrate on fixing this. We have to get the writing and the spelling up to speed, or she'll never be able to do anything. Can't do history because she can't spell, can't do Spanish because she can't spell in English. So that there's all that focus here. But my husband was saying that in China, the focus is very much, what are the children's strengths?
What
and
is it that you can do?
Let's harness the strength. Yeah. So it's not even down to just the way people interact with each other. It's the way they kind of bring out the best in you, or whether they crush you. So I'm not saying that in China it would be easy for autistics. Okay, I'm not saying that at all, but there are certain structures in place that I think would benefit us more than they do here. So the rules,
cultural norms, etc., might be more of an autistic cultural norm. Because this is the thing as well, because we're talking about sort of very established cultures. We're talking about, British culture. We're talking about Spanish culture and Japanese culture and so on. But we can also be talking about autistic culture, which is very much it exists, but it's in its infancy. So there's certainly, and that's not necessarily a standardized thing either, but there's, I feel, a lot of, well, the whole point is there's commonality amongst us as autistic people, regardless of what culture we're actually in.
I think we form a subculture in every culture, basically.
What else have I got of some notes that we were talking about? I mean, I've made it as a little jokey note thing in the description for this, which was, am I neurodivergent or just Greek? And that wasn't, I wanted to be clear actually that wasn't in relation to you, because what cultures? So you've lived in Malta,
I was born in Gibraltar.
Gibraltar, sorry.
Yeah. So I then moved to the UK. I then lived in Mallorca for 5 years, so one of the Balearic Islands. Then I came back to the UK. Then I moved out to Malta. So it's European places I've lived. But yeah, even there, even though it stayed within Europe, the cultural differences are massive. So in Malta, people didn't drop around your house for a cup of coffee. Even family they'd meet up at the festas, because there were festas going on all the time from May to November. There's fireworks and festas for every town, and they'd meet up at the events. But very rarely did people, go into each other's houses for coffees and stuff. They'd meet outside. And that's another thing, when people turn up at my house, I always say, even if it's my mother or my sister, two people I absolutely love and adore and would love to spend more time with, if I opened the door and they were there, I'd probably go, "What are you doing here?" Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
Because I'm just, it takes a lot of preparation to be able to let someone into my house. So again, even those cultural norms of, whether you meet outside, whether you meet indoors, those are issues. So massive differences depending on where you are. But yeah, I've lived in, like I say, Malta, Mallorca, England, and now I live in Wales. And I was born in Gibraltar. So everywhere has little differences in the way they do just about everything. And, even down to foods, what kind of foods can you get when you're out? Because here people tend to have a very bland palate. I think, if that's not too unfair to say, it's a bland palate where, some people like spicy food and stuff. They'll go for a curry. Some people would just pop to McDonald's or whatever. But, being raised on a Mediterranean cuisine and then coming here, it's very different. So I found that when I left home, for the first time in my life, I started realizing I don't like a lot of foods. I thought I liked everything and I could eat everything my mother gave me. I'd just knock it all back. And yet suddenly I was realizing actually there's loads of foods I don't like, and I can't, the textures and stuff, it was all different. So again, depending on where you've been raised or where your family, where the cuisine comes from, will depend on what kind of palate you end up having. So, and I thought it was down to what your parents feed you. So when I had my first daughter, I thought I was a wonderful parent because she would eat everything I gave her. She would have pizzas, she would have curries, she would have Chinese, she would have everything. And then along came my son. And age 2, all he would have was cold hot dogs and cold baked beans. And for a while I thought, I don't know how I'm going to change all of this. And we tried now he's got a much better palate. He eats a lot of different things. But at the time, it was like suddenly all the techniques I used with my daughter weren't working anymore because he'd just outright refuse food if it wasn't exactly what he wanted and what he was expecting. And if I got something and it was a different brand and it tasted different, then he'd never have that kind of food again. So it was really, really, eye-opening.
They're having their lovely little joke in the comment section about salad cream, but this is my thing with, so I don't tend to like other condiments anyway, very much, but I can have different brands of most condiments, but salad cream has to be Heinz. It is not the same if it's just because they've made the comment in the comment section. It's not the same if it's not Heinz. Nobody.
Well, it's like baked beans, isn't it? If you're used to having Heinz baked beans, you don't want one of the cheap packs from one of the local shops.
So things with baked beans and like spaghetti hoops and things like that. I'm not too fussed if it's a different brand, but some things have to be very particular, and some things are not so much of a problem. And I'm just thinking, your son, I'm assuming it was probably the consistency of hot dogs and baked beans because they're very consistent.
Yeah.
I mean, hot dogs are just very, very, what's the word? Oh no, what's the word?
Bland.
I wasn't going to go with bland, but
I'm going to go with bland. No, but they've got the same texture, haven't they? They're the same texture every time. Because like he wouldn't have fruit or vegetables, and it's like, well, because you can't predict. Sometimes you buy grapes, sometimes they're sweet, sometimes they're sour, sometimes they're soft, sometimes they're hard. You just can't predict what you're going to get.
It needs that consistency. Yeah.
So again, it's like the standardized greetings. Give us standardized food, please.
Standardized food, exactly. I don't know whether you can answer this question, and so feel free if you're not going to be able to. But Amy's just asking, how did you improve your son's diet because they're really struggling?
Over a long time. It took a long time. I mean, we're talking for about 6 months. He would only eat the hot dogs and beans. So it was really quite extreme. And he liked brioche. And that's the only bread product he would have. So in the end, we were really, really bad. We told him that the shop had run out and we couldn't get it. and that we had some other things that he could just snack on till it came back into the shop. And he was really young at the time, so he didn't realize that we were lying back then. And it felt horrible because I didn't want to go down that route of lying to my kid. But at the same time, he needed to have a better balanced diet. So then what we did was we introduced new things a bit at a time. So first of all, we told him there were no more brioche. We just couldn't get hold of them. And he did, after a couple of days, eat other things. But they were bland things. It was like regular bread and chips and things that, you know, were more predictable. Over time, we introduced like a new meal once a week. So would make a shepherd's pie, or would make a curry, or would make a Chinese, and he'd be able to have it. But if he didn't like it, would say, okay, then we'll get you something you like. We never forced him to eat the new stuff, but he was able to try it out. So we then discovered that he quite liked tuna and sweet corn. So, for example, once we knew he liked tuna and sweet corn in sandwiches and with pasta, we tried all varieties. And then we said, oh, and they do them on pizzas as well, because he wouldn't even eat pizzas. The thought was he just wouldn't even touch it. So bit by bit, we introduced new things that had the things he liked on it. So he'd either have a pizza with sausages cut up on it, or tuna and sweet corn, but would stick the familiar and add something new. And over time, you know, his palate did improve. He has a lovely wide-ranging variety of foods now. So it's just stick with it. Don't let them starve, because I'll tell you something, they will push their food away. They will go without.
Yeah, and I think because it's very much, isn't it? It's sensory, and there's so many things that go into that, when, particularly if you're an autistic person, when it comes to food when you're young. And so maybe, working out what foods are particularly consistent, I think is the key, actually, because introducing fruit would be really difficult for me. You know, fruit is a difficult one for me because of that inconsistency. And to some extent, I think it's one of the reasons why my sister and my niece actually got really put off meat, because of that inconsistency. And things like that. So needing that consistency. So at least things like
it's also
are consistent.
It's also the textures and stuff, because I remember I used to make him omelettes when he was really little that had like chopped up tomatoes, but I'd always peel the skin off first. Well, I made him one day that I didn't peel the skin off, and when he put it in his mouth, I honestly thought he'd got glass or something in his mouth, because he screamed. He was obviously, you know, in distress at what was in his mouth, and then I realized it was just a piece of tomato skin. So the skin had made that massive difference.
For Louis, autistic with attention differences, so he would have what you would class as a really bland palate, but he would say it's not, because he can taste everything so strongly. So he has, I would say he just loves a very Italian sort of based diet. So lots of herbs. He likes herbs. But he can't do black pepper. He says it burns on the way in and it burns on the way out. So why would he eat that?
I'm the same. I can't do pepper. It's absolutely horrible.
He's just telling me about his issue with pepper. And
pepper, I just don't like because it burns your mouth. But it's chili.
It's chili. If he ends up eating a chili by mistake,
hurts you going in, and food that hurts you coming out.
Yes. So why would you want that? So he.
I've never understood. My husband likes really hot food. I've never understood why you would do that.
So
when there's steam coming out of your eyes.
But I think what is important, what's interesting, is like, say, when people will say to Louis, well, that's a really like bland or whatever, and he's like, but it's really not. So for him, because they don't, particularly if they're neurotypical, they don't taste it the way he does, and he tastes everything particularly strongly, so he doesn't think it's bland at all. We've gone off on a really weird tangent, haven't we? I mean, in terms of Mediterranean food, I mean, obviously dependent on where we're talking about, but I very much like sort of Greek food, Spanish food. As long as it's not spicy, I'm okay. But there's particular things that I quite like. So I just want to come back to my strange little anecdote quote, which is, I won't out them, but they're a friend, colleague at another university, and they're really lovely. I really get on with them very well. And we can't decide if the reason I can get on with them so well is because they are also neurodivergent, or are they just Greek, right? And we've had this conversation, and it's just, it's a very interesting, amusing conversation, because I like their mode of communication, right? I get on with their mode of communication. There's no nonsense. It's all
use hands more as well.
Bit handy, yeah.
Which is people tend to be quite stiff when they're talking.
I'm quite movie when I'm interested or enthusiastic and talking. I like to, particularly if I'm training. I'm all over the place when I'm training. I'm bouncing. I've got my shoes off. I'm very excited. So yeah, I love chatting to this person, and I get on well with them, and I feel comfortable. When usually if they're neurotypical, I might feel a bit uncomfortable, or I'm struggling a bit with just the difference in how we understand one another and the communication. So yeah, we can't decide if it is that she's also neurodivergent, or it's just that for her and her family and the Greek culture is a very blunt, to the point, no nonsense, all this kind of thing, no small talk nonsense. And I love it. It's great. So, I mean, one of two things: either I found another neurodivergent person to be friends with, yay, or I found a whole culture that might actually be quite good for me, right? If I decided to leave the UK, for instance, would I fit in better in Greece with that culture? Any thoughts, anyone, on that? Actually, I don't know where everyone else is from. Actually, tell us. That would be interesting. If you're from anywhere other than the UK, which includes, you know, if you're in America, you know, what does it mean, I guess, to be autistic in your culture? Is there any differences in what you might get picked up, or why you might get picked up as autistic, for instance?
Yeah.
Which would be interesting. So while people are having a think about that, were there any other key things that you were really hoping to talk about in relation to being autistic in other cultures?
I'm trying to think, and as usual, my brain has gone,
Well, I'm double checking my notes. So we've talked about, am I neurodivergent or just Greek?
Spain, hello.
Spain, fantastic. And what's that like? Are you still in Spain, Anna? Are you in Spain right now, or are you in the UK or somewhere else? And what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be autistic there, I guess, is what we're asking. We've got lovely Brian. So US, or more likely Northern Virginia. Too deep in demands to mask. So yeah, too much demand there for Brian to be able to mask. Bobby, we've got lovely Bobby, American, and no clue really, wasn't picked up as a child, lived in the UK longer than the USA now, so Bobby's over here. Only just getting, I mean, they've known they're autistic for a while, but only just getting to that point of diagnosis. Okay, Anna's in London and has been for 20 years. Ree from the States, didn't know much about autism until 5 years ago, mid-40s. Brian, in the southern USA, everyone masks, even NTs. Interesting.
I think the other thing that I wanted to just mention as well is that when, you know, because like with my family, we'd have never thought autism, because actually the kids were just like us. We didn't know we were autistic. So it was kind of our cultural family dynamic. Yeah. We were saying, but they're normal. Yeah. You know, everything they're doing, it's normal to us. And when they got diagnosed, like one by one, you know, the things that the diagnosticians were saying of, you know, this may mean, and they talk about the deficits and they talk about the difficulties. And we were sat there, both of us, just thinking, but they're just like us. This doesn't compute. And it was after that we then went away and went, well, does that mean we are too? And if you think in cultures, you know, if it's normal to speak over people, well, how are you going to notice if your child is having difficulty waiting their turn? If it's absolutely normal in that culture to behave in a certain way.
But that's the thing, in the right setting, that person is just autistic with no deficits in quotation marks, because it's just the norm. right? And that's what's so interesting, so important about these sorts of discussions about cultural differences when you're autistic. And I'm thinking of so what you just described, like, you know, you're getting that diagnosis for your young people and it's all deficit and they're going to end up like this and blah blah blah. And I'm sure Nick Walker, when she was on, said something along the lines of, but that doesn't sound fun. I'm not going to be that way, kind of thing, in the sense of, because we don't have to meet those sorts of negative expectations when somebody non-autistic realizes and tells us that we're autistic, kind of thing. Anna, being straightforward is the norm. If you don't say what you mean in Spain, you're a bit weird. The UK is so much harder.
That's it. When I came here, suddenly people were telling me I was aggressive and confrontational. And it's like, but I'm just telling people what, you know, I'm just being straightforward. I'm just being honest. And in Spain, it was perfectly acceptable to roll down your window and tell a stranger, you shouldn't do that. Or to tell kids in the beach, I'll tell your mum what you're doing. Here, they wouldn't dream of doing that. It's like there's this unwritten, you can't interact with other people. And there, you know, it was just, that's the way it was. So suddenly coming here, that became a deficit of mine, whereas there it really wasn't.
And I think it's almost, and this is what I talk about, this is why I say, so we're talking about established cultural places and norms and etc., and how we might be perceived, I guess, or experience being autistic in those places. But the thing that I'm talking about quite a lot, so when I've had a few meetings with different NHS bods, for instance, and we're talking about how do we change the culture across the NHS or across employment, or, you know, you're doing that, you're out in those employment in organizations and things, trying to change the culture of non-autistic people, basically, and how they perceive us. And so I've had conversations with a number of people now saying, because they've asked me, what does that mean to you? What does cultural change mean to you? And I say, well, actually, you're talking, or I'm talking and thinking about two different things. I'm talking and thinking about the wider cultural change of how you appreciate and understand autistic people. But more importantly, I want you to actually start recognizing us as a culture, as opposed to a pathologized group of individuals, just seeing us as little islands of people with autism. Stop doing that. And see us as a cultural, I don't want to necessarily use the term minority, but a culture in and of itself.
I do. I call us a neurominority. But, you know, at the end of the day, we have our own cultural norms. We have our own behaviors that are normal to us. And a lot of the time people pathologize, like play. Autistic children don't play properly. They spin the wheels of cars and they line things up. Who says that's not playing properly? It may not be playing the way neurotypical children play, but it's still playing properly for us, and it's still enjoyable.
And they're enjoying it, and
that's
they're getting anything out of it, even if it's just a bit of reprieve or a little bit of quiet, for instance. And so I feel like I did have a train of thought about the point that I was trying to make about the cultural thing, and I've lost it now. Oh no. So yes, it's important to see us as a culture, and then being more understanding the way we would hopefully, obviously there's lots of prejudice still everywhere, so if we do have people from different cultures in the UK, you know, there's still problems with prejudice and so on. So but ideally, if you've got somebody who doesn't, you know, English isn't their native language, you usually give them a bit of slack when it comes to understanding them, because you know that they are making an effort to communicate in a language that's actually not their native language. Do that with us. That's what we need. We want, you know, those individuals, non-autistic people, see us in that cultural minority way and understand that there's a communication difference because we are coming from those different cultural backgrounds. I think I'm hoping that's my push anyway, that would be the best way to reduce stigma, the best way to humanize us.
And probably the most accurate way to do it. Because I'll tell you something, since I've been diagnosed, I've realised that a lot of my old friends are actually autistic as well. And some of them are fully aware of it, and some of them maybe not so much, but I can see it clear as day. You know, Autdar is strong. And I've managed, because of my work as well, and because of the advocacy and the things I do, I'm surrounded by autistic people. So whenever I do functions and I'm around loads of autistic people, it's like the first time that I feel comfortable and able to be myself. And I can spot when people are feeling distressed and I can help them. And it just, that kind of community isn't there for me when it's a neurotypical space. And I think that's a massive sign to me that it's a culture. We are actually, we have a cultural norm, and that's why we can understand each other, but not necessarily understand neurotypicals.
If I think about, so as you know, students, PhD students, master students, you tend to go to a lot of conferences and you have to put up posters. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, you have to do a poster. You always have to do a poster. Anyway, and then talk about your poster. It's very bizarre. And I've done a number of those, and I even now, because I'm very hyper fan, so I'm seeing it all, and I'm seeing myself, or from the perspective I had at that time anyway, from these different conferences, and there being, say, for instance, you know, an academic that I actually would have really liked to talk to, or, you know, me just trying to be part of that non-autistic space. And in my head, all I can remember and imagine is me hovering really awkwardly, trying to work out how to get in. How do I get in to that conversation there? How do I talk to that person there? And I've also attended a small number, nowhere near as many as the non-autistic conferences, but I've attended a small number of autistic conferences, completely different.
Yeah.
You just go up to the person and you just go, I want to talk about this.
Yeah. And that's the other thing, knowing what to talk about. So in neurotypical culture, you know, here we talk about the weather.
Yeah, gross.
In Spain, no one ever talked about the weather. It's hot every day. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's hot every day. So again, we didn't do small talk as much in Spain. You know, we talked about things, and it was easier to have conversations there than it's ever been here. Because here I'm trying to work out, am I allowed to info dump? You know, do they have any interest in the topic I want to talk about? Or do I have to keep trying to work out how to respond to a topic that I'm not at all interested in? Because that's the bottom line. You know, I don't get why we even talk about certain topics, especially if it's just small talk. You know, I don't need to hear myself speak. I can sit in silence and be perfectly happy. And I can, you know, go to a room with friends. I say, you know, me and my husband, we parallel play better than anyone. You know, we can sit in the same room and do different things and not be talking to each other, but it's not uncomfortable. But if we were to do that with neurotypical people, they'd start saying, well, we've come to see you, or, you know, we expect to sit down and actually talk with you, or, you know, that there's that aspect as well of, you know, well, actually, it's fine to be silent in your own company, and it's fine to be silent amongst friends. So, yeah.
And we've flagged in the comment section and on the screen, we've got different Aucademy autistic closed groups, and one of them is an info dump vaults group. That one's on Discord, so it's for 13 years plus, so there's no swearing and things like that. So to make sure it's nice and safe for 13, I know, yeah, for 13. The other groups are like 16 years plus, but that one is specifically interested in something. Come and info dump about it. You will find somebody else to info dump about it with, because that's a very beautiful, valid mode of communicating with somebody. And what I do find interesting is that whilst we don't do the neurotypical small talk about weather, two things. We talk amongst each other, small talk about how neurotypical people talk about the weather. This could, don't we? Right?
We do.
It ends up being a discussion in and of itself. But importantly, if an autistic person does talk about the weather, it's interesting because it's not small talk. It's things like this. It's like Brian here, who likes looking at weather models, and then people will have a good conversation. It's not just the, isn't it wet? Or, oh, it's so hot.
I think that's what I love about autistic spaces. No matter what that person, what their what their particular interest is, or their field of expertise. Okay, let's call it what it is. It's an area that they've looked into in depth. I'm fascinated by every topic that autistic people have talked to me about because they have such depth of knowledge. And I always come away thinking, I've learned so much. And yet with neurotypical people, there's that don't bore me kind of aspect of, you're going too deep into things and we don't want to talk about things in that depth. And I think, well, actually, I absolutely love it. So even if it's a topic I'm not interested in, I love to hear. It's like scientists. I don't understand science. I really don't. But I love watching scientists talk about their projects and getting that gleam in their eye because they love the topic and it's exciting to them. And I feel that excitement, even though I don't understand the topic properly. It's still something I come away thinking, I've really enjoyed that. They may as well have been talking about comics or something. So long as they have the passion for what they're talking about, and I love it.
And again, it's the cultural differences that our small talk really isn't small talk; it's big talk. And the purpose of it, it's the purpose, isn't it? And the motivation. The purpose is to exchange information.
Yeah.
Whereas small talk for non-autistic people is purely a social.
Yeah.
Like,
and it's not even accurate. It's not even accurate because for years, my husband nudges me when people say, "How are you?" He nudges me to remind me to say, "Fine, how are you?" Because otherwise, if I've had a bad day, I'll tell them and I'll go into great detail. And, you can see after a while, they're desperate to get away. That wasn't what they were looking for. And I think, well, why did you ask me? Why say, how are you, if you don't want to know?
End up the opening, particularly if there's somebody a non-autistic person that I've only just met, and it's online usually at the moment, and they ask that question. And I think, why would you ask somebody you don't know?
Yeah.
Kind of thing. So I just end up for about 10 minutes explaining to them why that's such a terrible question to ask autistic people. And
one and what do you do? They're the two worst questions in my book. How are you and what do you do? Because whenever someone says, what do you do? I think, well, I raise children and I make craft stuff. I do things with my hands. I just don't know how to answer that question properly. What they mean is, what do you work in? Of course. But, that's no great bonding conversation thing either. And it tends to have hierarchies and, some people, so those two questions to me, the how are you and what do you do? Horrible questions.
That's why I tend to be more, what are you, who are you and what are you interested in?
Yeah.
Which might include if you are an autistic disabled person who is in employment. Not all of us are. So there's that issue as well. Not everybody you're going to interact with. If you say, what do you do for a living? It makes a really big assumption. Whereas, and to some extent, why are we asking that?
Why does it even matter?
Yeah. Whereas if you ask, what are you interested in? It might include their work, or So for me, it absolutely does, because I've carved out some. I'm very broke, but that's not the point. I've carved out, being able to do things that I'm particularly interested in. So if somebody asks me, what are you interested in? It will include what I do work-wise. But otherwise, it's a very strange question. I'm conscious of the time, so I think it's good to move on to LARPing. And I do have my little note, which is LARPing, better ways than ABA.
Yeah.
So do you want to tell us what LARPing is?
Okay, so live action role playing is what it stands for. And it's, to summarize, it's when people get dressed up in fantasy costumes. If you're doing the fantasy genre, you get dressed up in fantasy costumes, you use latex weapons, and you go out into the wilderness and you have to like solve plots. So you get the referee who's written the scenario and runs it. You get the party, who are the people who pay to go, and then you get the crew or the monsters, the people who turn up to play all the different parts, so that it's like a living event that's completely reactive depending on what the party do. So it's absolutely fascinating to do. But the reason that I wanted to bring it up was because before you were saying in some cultures, am I autistic or am I just Greek? I can honestly say the reason I believe so strongly in the social model of disability is because when I used to do LARP, when I used to go on events, I never, ever, ever felt disabled like I do in normal life. So I'd go away, I'm putting on a costume. I'm pretending to be someone else anyway. So I don't have to mask as myself. I can mask as my orc. Orcs are fun to be. And, you get to play your character. But while you're doing that, you're making friends with other people who are playing characters. So I didn't know what most of my friends did for a living. I must have known people for like 4 years before I even found out what some of them did. Because I was getting to know their characters. So we'd go on events and we'd be choosing, well, let's bring this person and that person because we're trying to get a party that's balanced. So we need our mage, we need our fighters, we need our scouts, do you know what I mean? So you're going and you're picking people according to their skills and their character class. And the thing that always fascinated me is I'm dyspraxic. Okay, I can fall over while standing still. I bump into things all the time. I can't walk on a straight pavement without tripping all the time. It's like I can't tell where my feet are half the time. And yet I was out in the countryside running over the most uneven terrain with things chasing me, and I didn't seem to have that problem that I have in neurotypical life. Yeah, I mean, definitely it's a wild ride. And if you can get over the whole, being dressed up, I mean, it was sometimes we'd go to places and we used to call them Joe Public. Okay. So we'd all be dressed up in costume and all, playing our different characters and stuff. And would get people who were walking dogs or scouts or something were out in the fields and they'd spot us and they'd think that we were rehearsing for a show or something. That they'd be looking for the cameras. Where are these people being filmed? So there are some people that get quite subconscious that they're a little concerned that they might be spotted. But for most of us, once you're in it and you're playing that character, it's just fun. And the thing is, you get the adrenaline. So even though you're not going to die, the fact that you've got this character, that you've done their costume, you've made their costume, you've taken years buying all the accessories and you've got all the gadgets and stuff. You go out, you've got all your weaponry and everything. If that character dies, well, you've got to start again from scratch. You've got to make a new costume, make a new character and all of that. That absolutely, there is a crossover between LARPing and cosplay. But they are different. So like I was saying, when you're LARPing, you're going to an event where there's a scenario, there's something going on that's outworldly, to do with I will definitely link you to some awesome.
Oh, that was more
UK
for
based.
Sorry.
Right. But I can get you links for UK LARP companies. But when you go into the event, you're doing something that is, like I say, you have your referees, people that have written the scripts, people that have written exactly what's going to happen. They've made the props, they've planned everything, and then you've got the monsters that go in, and there's interaction. It's like I forget the word, but when you're acting and it's all you're making it up as you go along.
Method acting? No.
Nope.
Oh,
Ad-libbing. Yeah,
Yeah.
improvisation. So you've got your rough guide of what's going on and you know what your character's meant to be, but it's all improvisation. It's all ad-libbed. Whereas cosplay is more, you're trying to imitate someone from the TV. So it might be a anime character or a superhero or something. So the cosplay is trying to imitate someone, whereas the LARPing is giving a personality to a costume and bringing it to life.
There's so many things there, isn't there? So there's structure, there's some scripting because there's guidance and you kind of know to some extent at least, dependent on the LARP, what you're supposed to be doing, etc. But there's also not necessarily that expectation to be neurotypical, because you're playing fantasy characters or sci-fi characters or whatever it might be. So it's allowing, I guess. I mean, I've not really done any, so you correct me, but allowing you to be social, to learn different skills, I guess, but without that neurotypical social skills expectation.
Yeah. So, for example, being dyslexic, all my schooling life and my work life, I've felt bad about my inability to write fluently and consistently. Especially because I've worked in advertising and stuff where, if you make a mistake, they're going to come down on you. So it was always, the pressure's always there to, other people can read better than me, other people can write better than me. Very conscious that I have this deficit. In LARPing, we used to have rune sets. So we'd have like an elven script, a magic script, power script, and they all had different characters for every letter. So whereas in English, I read like the average 6-year-old, I think. When I first pick up a book, I'm very slow. I'm working out what each word is one at a time. So it's not fluent, it's not fluid for sure, but I can read it. It just sounds bad. Well, suddenly what I realized was that I could learn the other scripts. I could learn the rune sets quite easily, and I could read them as fluently as I could read English. So even though being dyslexic, I've always been notably worse at reading than most people, suddenly put me in this environment where we have different rune sets, and I was able to learn them faster than most people.
And is it with runes, they're more pictorial than they are the way that, for instance, the Western world anyway writes letters?
Yeah.
So it's potentially that your dyslexic brain,
the pictures.
It was the well, yeah, but the pictures weren't the thing that causes the problem. Because it really isn't the case that people who experience dyslexia have a problem. It's that we in the Western world have developed a form of written language that doesn't meet.
And again, it's cultural. It's cultural because here in England, we have words spelt stupidly, if I may say so. There's no logic almost to the way we spell some words. In Spain, letters are the way they're pronounced pretty much all the time. So once you know how to pronounce something, you can then read and you can improve your reading, getting quicker. It's not got the same things where you stop and you're like, well, I don't know why. Is that going to be a silent K this time, or is that going to be a silent
on the
P?
Context and things. There's a really funny. So it's like a TikTok, but I watched them on Instagram, and it's somebody who's American pretending to be talking to a version of themselves that's French, and the French person is asking, how do we pronounce these words? And it's like dough. So like, kneading dough. Yeah. Well, why is that different to though and through and, all these things? And it's like, but it's the same letters.
Yeah.
Why is this different here
Yeah.
to here?
Yeah. So
and things
English
like
is a
that.
dyslexic's nightmare, whereas Spanish is a much more phonetic language. So I think when you've got a more phonetic language, it's easier. So I'm less dyslexic in Spanish than I am in English, but only because of the structure of the language. So
Yeah.
again, even when it comes to, it's not just the cultural differences, it's the way language is written as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think maybe, again, China with its pictorial images for things, maybe that would have suited me much more than learning English. But
And
yeah,
I
in the
don't
live
know,
role playing.
yeah, I don't know
Sorry.
if anyone actually has any knowledge at all on where, like you say, in, for instance, China, is there less dyslexia? Is it the same? Is it different because of the pictorial way of depicting words and letters? I don't know, so I have no knowledge
And
of that.
again, we don't know whether it's, you know, in Spain, I believe there's less dyslexia. It's still there, and I'm still dyslexic when I'm reading Spanish. Okay,
Yeah.
just not quite as badly as I am with English. But is it because that there's a lack of diagnosis, or is it because the language is easier? So, you know, we don't even know that basic thing.
That's true.
But my feeling is that whenever the language is phonetic, it's easier for us, because again, it's that standardization.
Yeah.
You know, we just need things to be the same every time. And like you say, through, though, that, you know, where's the logic in why things change the way they're said? And then there's some words that are spelt the same and they're pronounced differently. So live and live, you know, you have to know the context to be able to get it right.
Very frustrating. And I still don't know the basics to understand even, you know, what's a verb, etc., etc. I get very confused. So
yeah, so in live role playing, that was one of the things that I saw as a strength. So I wasn't diagnosed with anything back when I was live role playing. And I used to think, why is it I'm not disabled in this environment? And then I'd start to realize, well, actually in neurotypical life, I can't read and write like everyone else. But in this environment, I'm actually, you know, when we get runes on a dungeon, and, you know, usually the referee has set a crib sheet somewhere. So the party have to go and find the crib sheet in order to translate the runes. And I'd always say, just leave me with the runes. And, you know, there'd be 3 or 4 of us that would sit there, and it turns out all autistic, but we'd sit there and we'd work out what they were, because so long as we could work out what one word was, we'd get the letters from that, and we'd be able to decipher the whole room by the time they found the crib sheet. So to me, that was a huge strength. Then there were things like, you know, I was particularly good at doing traps, like disarming traps and things like that. Well, in real life, how would I have ever learnt that? I'd have no idea, you know, unless I was a burglar, which is not something, you know, we should really be going down. But on the events, I was able to realize that actually I've got a good eye for being able to disarm things and, you know, get into things that other people can't get into. And, you know, then like making costumes. I didn't know that other people needed patterns to make costumes, because I'm like you, I'm a hyper fan. So I can see things, and whether it's furniture or clothing, I can see it in my mind. I don't need to close my eyes. I just look at it, I see it, and then I start to unpick it. So I can tell exactly how it's made. So I'd be able to buy material, chuck it on the floor, get the scissors and just start chopping into it. And other people would be going, how on earth are you doing that? How do you know? And it's like, because I can see it. So I learned I had all these skills through live role playing that I don't think I'd have ever discovered if I hadn't done that. And I think that was the main thing for me, the realizing the skills that you can, you know, in one environment, you have strengths. You're sought after because you're actually good at things. In another environment, you're classed as disabled, and you feel disabled by the way the system's set up. And yeah, I can understand people who say, oh no, I think my autism or my dyslexia is a disability, because in our society it's totally disabling. But like I say, when you change the culture, when you change the society, and even though live role playing, it was mainly people from the UK that went, but of course when they're playing orcs and elves, they're playing different cultures. So elves have a different culture to orcs. So you get to experiment with all these different things, and you also get to learn how to interact with people.
It's perspective taking as well, because there's a bit more, there's that clearer, this is what an orc is potentially like, this is what an elf is potentially like, etc. So it's allowing also, it sounds like a bit of perspective taking,
Yeah.
like a number of things.
And again, you're getting to play different parts. So if you go on an event and you're playing like the monsters, then you'll probably play 20 different things. You'll be an elf 1 minute, then you'll have to be a goblin the next minute. So you're having to put on all these different personas. And in a way, you get to experiment with social behavior in a safe setting. So when I played my orc, if I behaved the way my orc behaved in real life, I'd be probably arrested, quite frankly, because I was a troublemaker. But it was fun. But in normal life, you've got to be really careful about how you interact with people, because you don't want to upset people. In that live role-playing environment, if you messed up, the worst that would happen is your character would get hit with a sword. So it's a perfectly safe environment, and you get to play lots of different personalities. So I've, played like leaders of clans, and I've led armies and stuff in live role playing, and the confidence that gave me to be able, when I then went into the workplace, I was told, or when I was elected, because I was elected borough councillor, and I can remember ringing up my friends saying, what have I done? How am I going to do this? And they said, Monique, just role play it. Just role play it. And they were right. You find the people that are doing the role that you're going to do, and the ones that are doing it well, and you just role play doing it like them. Same as you role play being an orc when orcs don't really exist. You just see what the description is, and you role play that. It gives you that skill.
We had a discussion about this, didn't we? Because I think what's important is the nuance between, there's a difference, and an important difference between masking, and particularly unconsciously masking, which we do as a survival mechanism in lots of neurotypical spaces, compared to taking control and being able to be in a space because you've learned how to be in that space, etc., but you're not necessarily having to sacrifice who you are. Because Kieran Rose, obviously, when we talk about masking, and his whole thing is actually he's not trying to or demand or even expect people to demask. What he talks about more is being in control of the mask, so that it's not in control of you. So I think it's interesting, and it's an important nuance, because what you're talking about could potentially really help people without having to sacrifice who you are.
That's it. So, you get, absolutely. So I know I can go anywhere, and I can mask long enough to be able to tell a select group of people, or whoever's important that needs to know, and advocate for myself to say, look, these are the behaviors you're going to see and stuff, so that I can prepare them for the me that's going to be there regularly. But I choose to mask just long enough to do that. Other times, it's not a choice. Like you say, other times it's a survival technique. You have to mask, or things will go horribly wrong for you. So I'm in that lucky position where I've got to a place where I've learnt the skills to be able to appear neurotypical for a short amount of time. And I use that to be able to make sure people understand I'm not neurotypical. This isn't how I'm going to behave all the time. But when I start doing this stuff that you might think is weird, it's just because I'm autistic. And that seems to be working for me. It seems to give me that little safety net of, but it's still hard. I wish I didn't even have to do the masking, to warn people.
But I think coming back to the use of LARPing, maybe for autistic people, to work out who they are by playing other people.
Yeah.
Right. I think there's like I say, there's a number of interesting things there. There's the potentially learning about perspective taking, because actually not all autistic people, but a lot of autistic people are actually very good at perspective taking against the stereotype that we're not. But it actually takes us it probably takes us longer, and we do it in a different way to non-autistic people. So it seems, I have no idea how, that non-autistic, or neurotypical people, because obviously non-autistic might still be neurodivergent, but neurotypical people seem to naturally learn this stuff, naturally have this skill to be able to perspective take. Actually, they're very poor at perspective taking often. Whereas if we do learn to perspective take as autistic people, again, because not everybody does, we seem to do it in a much more, almost like a little controlled experiment way. We're working this stuff out. So I think anything that can potentially, without making us mask, help us with that.
Yeah.
I think.
And the thing is with live role playing, I mean, the events I used to go to I used to go to a very combat heavy system. And I now realize it's because I've got a very low, I'm hyposensitive to pain. So, I'd come away from an event and I'd be covered head to toe in bruises, absolutely beaten, senseless, and I'd feel grounded. I'd get home, I'd have that bath, I'd count my trophies. I used to call them, I've got some big trophies this week. But it helped to ground me. It helped to calm me, and it helped to, so that aspect as well. But when you do a very combat heavy system, it means after every fight, they call time out, because the referee has to go and work out who's died, who's injured, who needs healing, and those kind of things. So while that was going on, you get to just sit down quietly and just have that chill out time that, in real life, when you're at work, they don't say time out, everyone can just relax for 5 minutes while we do something. So in the live role playing, I was able to do that. And when I first started, I was quite shy. I didn't really talk with many people. So I chose to play a scout. So the scout was never with the party. So even if the party was a whole group of like 12 people, I'd be off doing something else. I'd be off, up halfway up the mountain trying to find the next encounter, and doing that. Still important to the party. They wanted me there because I'd help them save their lives at times. But for me, it meant I could take a full part while being myself, not feeling under pressure to talk, not feeling under pressure to interact. But then, as I got more and more into it, then I started doing the crewing and the monstering, playing all the different parts. And then eventually I went for my orc, which was just a really, in your face and really, I could wear the grubbiest of clothes and I could be absolutely gross and no one judged me, because I was playing an orc. Whereas in real life, I'm really bad when I sneeze. I'm glad we have masks now, because I can never get my hand up to my face in time. So when I sneeze, it's achoo, and it goes everywhere. So in normal life, that's horrible. People look at you like, oh, that was disgusting. Couldn't you cover your mouth? Whereas on the events, it was just like, that orc is really, really quite gross. And it was just left at that, but it was just funny. So I was able to, even down to the not being able to cover my mouth when I sneeze and things like that, I was just able to be me in all these different roles. And it allows you to practice people skills. And it allows you to learn and develop social skills. in a way that I've not found anything else that even comes close. So you hear a lot of kids are being taken into ABA because, you know, that they have to be shown how to be neurotypical to mix in this neurotypical world. And I think, well, actually, you'd be better off just shoving them into live role playing, because they'd learn the same skills without that feeling that their way is wrong, without that underlying you have to be neurotypical to succeed. It would just give them the skills to mask or to camouflage, to play that character for that little bit of time, to you know, be able to develop that. And whether that comes from role playing or acting, or as someone said, you know, theatre classes, it's all the same thing. It all gives you the possibility to learn these social things in a safe setting,
as opposed to in this intervention type
that's it
way that's, like you say, very much about really teaching non-autistic neurotypical social skills, which are not our social skills. They're not ours. They're not our cultural communication. I just want to, so because the time, I never get it within an hour. Everyone knows this. I just wanted to mention as well, because I've only had basically 1 or 2 experiences with LARPing, which is not the same, because there's so many ways that you can live action role play. So when I sort of came across it, I knew about it, but when I came across it in terms of being involved in some capacity, it was actually with a PhD student that we had at the time called Adam James. And I found it really interesting. So it was a particular short, very short, sort of guided LARP, and it was nothing like the sort of things you've described. And the actual scenario that sort of Adam guided us through, so I can't remember how many of us there were, but there was roughly enough that there was, I think, 4 people in 3 groups, so maybe it was 12 people, or maybe it was 3, I can't remember. Anyway, the whole LARP, you couldn't use traditional speech. So the idea was that in your groups, guided by Adam, you were to create a monster, that you as a small group were the monster with and you're the different parts within it, if that makes sense. So you couldn't speak, you couldn't communicate with one another. So when he would say, what does your monster sound like, test some noises out, you would do that together, and then without being able to speak, indicate, okay, this is our noise, right? And things like this. So once we'd done that for a while and done all the building up of who we were as a monster, we were then asked by Adam to go and meet the other monsters and exchange a gift. And our monster, I don't know how we did it, given that we couldn't communicate with, you know, traditional speech. Our monster kind of built up this energy ball and would give it as a gift to the other monsters. And then because of all that energy we'd put into doing that, we would kind of run away to collect our energy back up again, right? Now, what was really interesting was at the end of the session, what Adam did was sit down and he said, right, everyone come and sit. Monster there, monster there, monster there, and now you can communicate. I'm translating the alien languages. Basically, we were allowed to speak again, and we could ask each other questions. And what was really interesting was the other monsters said to our monster, I didn't think you liked us. I didn't understand why you ran away and all this kind of thing. I thought it was really actually quite rude because we'd given you a gift and then you gave us one and just ran away. And we got to explain, well, actually, what we gave you was energy. We were like some out in space monster, and we had to go back to build it back up again, kind of thing. And we got to translate that, and I found it a really interesting, because I knew I was autistic at that time as well. So I said, you know what, this is really a perfect example of the double empathy problem.
Yeah,
we have not been able to communicate in a shared language. And you have completely misinterpreted a perfectly lovely, you know, experience and gesture and what have you. And I found it really interesting for that.
Yeah.
So I thought, you know, little LARPs, for instance, could actually be a really good training tool.
Absolutely.
To demonstrate to non-autistic people. You could literally have just a group of neurotypical people doing that LARP in particular, and go, now imagine you're an autistic person. So even though we're speaking in the same language, you didn't understand, etc., etc. So I found it really, really interesting for that.
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing I found interesting was finding out just how many of my old friends from LARPing turned out to be neurodivergent.
I imagine we attract or get attracted to, I think.
That's it. Well, it wasn't just neurodivergent people.
No.
I think people who are, if I use the word geeky, into their IT and into their science and stuff like that, they were quite into it as well. And again, autistic people and scientists, we tend to get along quite well as well. They tend to be more introverted, and less chatty about mundane stuff. So again, you find that groups actually gel together quite well. But yeah, I think there were an awful lot of neurodivergent people in LARP at the time. And like I say, for some of them, they've been able to build businesses around their costumes, their weapons, the things that they made for that hobby, because the skills that we had were things that you just wouldn't discover in real life, just in your day to day.
Selling it to a lot of people. So it just, there's potential for, making friends. If you struggle to make friends, you could probably.
Well, it's where I met my husband.
There you go. Potentially help you build a bit of confidence, maybe build on your own, whatever they might be, your own social skills. So again, we're not trying to force this idea at all of neurotypical social skills, but your personal communication and skills. And like I say, I do like this idea as well, that potentially there are people out there who could do guided LARPs, short ones, to demonstrate the double empathy problem to non-autistic people, get them to really perspective take with us, which, they're really quite poor at doing, as we all know.
They are.
Are there any other key things you were hoping you'd get to talk to us about in terms of LARPing? Do you feel that
I think we've probably covered most of it. I mean, at the end of the day, I could talk about it for hours. I haven't even done it for years, but, for a long time, I'd say it was my life. It wasn't just an intense interest that I had. It's something, even when I was working, every weekend, I was making things, either making props or making costumes or making weapons or going to events. And there were rituals and things, when it comes to packing for an event, that's a ritual, because you've got to make sure you've got all your bits and all your notes, all your scroll sets.
There's again, other things. So we've talked about perspective taking, we've talked about skills building, but also the structure, the written rules.
And there's the written rules. So for some of us, being able to advance our characters, so in D&D, Dungeons and Dragons, it's all paper based, and you get your little statues, and you can paint your little statues if you want to, but you can just do it completely paper based. And there's some people who enjoy it because they enjoy building the characters. So, working out someone's strength, their dexterity, working out what kind of damage they can do, those kind of things we're really good at as well. So it's the rules behind it also helped. And not just that, but when you've got a lot of live role players, we tend to only talk about live role playing amongst each other, because it's not something that, you don't go out to the mums at the school, wouldn't want to hear about it, so you kind of build it all up. And when you're going to an event and you're talking to other people that are going to the event, you just start, you info dump massively to each other, and it's welcomed. It's wanted, because they want to know what happened on that adventure. They want to know whether that guy's going to turn out to be a bad guy, or did he do something to help you? It was just easy to be autistic.
I wonder if, again, because I always come back to whether the person thinks in pictures or not is one of the key things. I will probably mention it every session as much as possible, because it impacts things so much. So I wonder to what extent LARPing might be easier or better in some capacity for AFANs, of people who can't think in pictures at all, because there's the more tangible, compared to, for instance, like you say, D&D, where it is imagination, purely imagination. Because when I mentioned to you, I've literally had one, it wasn't even really D&D in the sense of, it was a version, you know.
Yeah.
There's
lots of them. Like. There's lots of different types.
It was a knockoff, if you like. So the professor that did it, so it was when I was a PhD student, my partner actually came. So he's 6'3" with beard, and he played, his character was, I think it was like a female orc or something. And he was getting very annoyed when everyone kept misgendering him, because he was a female orc and they kept misunderstanding who he was, etc., etc. Anyway, so the professor had like a wipeable mat that was like a grid. So I'm sure even people who don't know this, people who know this stuff already know what I'm talking about, and people who don't. So it was like a grid, and he would draw in like a wipeable pen the space. So like we were in a pub first, or an inn, and then this was the building, and there's some steps and stuff like that. And I'm seeing it as I'm talking about it and describing it. And at the same time, it's superimposed with, so even though that was flat and it's just drawn, in my mind, it also is superimposed with the actual building that the professor was describing. So I'm, like I say, so I feel that something like D&D would potentially be a lot easier for somebody like myself who's a hyperfan, because I can visualize it. I can still see us in our characters going down into the basement, and there were a load of chairs and stuff in the way, and we had to break those down, blah, blah, blah. None of that existed, you know, this kind of thing. So, I do wonder if there'll be different, if you don't think in pictures, or if you do.
Well, I know a few people who used to do LARP. My husband doesn't think in pictures. He really struggles to visually imagine anything. And he coped just fine. And I mean, the thing is, with LARP, you know, when you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, if someone says, right, there's a 7-foot troll running at you, you say, well, my character's strong and it's going to stand there and he's going to fight. In LARP, you know, there's an element of you're still the human inside. And when something massive, because they have some amazing costumes, they really do, that, you know, amazing costumes. And when that's charging at you, you know, the adrenaline, they go, okay, you're not going to die, but the adrenaline that goes through your body as you're in the situation, there's no having to imagine anything. You know, you don't have to imagine that there's smoke coming off in the distance, because they've got it's actually happening. Or a wolf howls off you hear it. You know, it's all there and it's all happening live, and it's up to you to react to it and try to role play the character you're playing, rather than, you know, whenever people do their basic dungeon, their first ever dungeon, I find it quite funny, because when they get scared, they kind of freeze and they laugh, because it's, you know, the human inside is going, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do.
I actually got annoyed though, because everyone was being so cautious. Louis got really annoyed because everyone just wanted to roll a dice for literally every tiny thing, because a number of them hadn't played before either. So they wanted to roll the dice for every tiny little thing. And Louis, autistic with attention differences, was just like, I just want to charge in with my big sword, kind of
That's
thing.
it. And in live role playing, that's exactly what happens. So you get some parties where, you know, you've got diplomats, you've got people that are really trying hard to solve the scenario, to make a pact with this group over here. And then you've got the ones that are just like, I'm sorry, I've had enough, I'm charging in. So everyone is able to just do what they enjoy and play the kind of character that they enjoy. So if you want to be a really serious, you know, elder who takes everything, you know, and looks at transcripts and things like that, you can do that. If you want to be someone who, you know, doesn't think about anything and just wants to get out there and, you know, get into fights, you can do that as well. You know, so it gives you the whole range of ways of expressing yourself. And if you're doing it for long enough, then you'll try all those different ways. So
And which
it
one
just,
fits you, maybe? And
yeah.
fantastic.
So it does. It opens up a whole world of
Yes, I
experience.
think there's going to be a number of people. We a good link for some good LARPing, either groups or guides in the UK would be useful.
There's quite a few. There's quite a few here in the UK. I mean, back in the 80s, we had Dungeons and Dragons, and then I think it was the 90s, we had Peckford and Castle, which was the first live role-playing site in the UK. But since then, there's probably clubs in the woodlands near you. Most universities have a LARPing club.
Yeah, exactly. And then this is what I say, with this particular PhD student whose PhD was on something in relation to LARPing. I can't remember exactly what it was. And some of the things he talked about sounded really interesting. Some of them sounded really quite harrowing, some of the stories that he'd been part of. And some of them sounded fascinating. I think one of them was over days they played it was like time traveling vampires or something really, really random.
Cool.
For like several days, which sounded amazing. Anyway, yes, we could definitely keep going, but we can't because dinner time and all that kind of thing. So final thoughts on LARPing? Just do it.
Final thoughts are, I think if it's your cup of tea, if you're the kind of person that likes new experiences, that doesn't mind dressing up, getting dirty, and staying out in a field for a few days or whatever, give it a go. Give it a go, because it does. It teaches us so much, because we're just able. It's like playing. Why do kids stop playing? Why are we told you're too old to play? You shouldn't be doing these things at your age. Well, actually, you should be doing them. They're great fun and you can get a lot from it. So there are clubs all around the country. There's massive events that happen. There's some festivals and stuff, as well as the regular live role-playing events.
More like me, and I don't like being outside, because nature touches you without consent, like dirt and bugs and all this kind of thing, which is very upsetting. Then I think D&D would be more my style, particularly again because I'm a hyper fan, so I can do I can imagine exactly those scenarios that are being described and so on. So I think there's something for everyone. I just wanted, this is just Sai would like to role play an old wizard that has a bed in the middle of the field and just sleeps, occasionally shouting at people to die quietly. And Victoria would like to be a napping orc.
Well, for the pair of you, there are festivals around the country where you could do exactly that if you wanted to. You just turn up for a weekend and just enjoy it. I mean, I love going to the festivals because you get to see everyone in all the different costumes as well. And it's a sight, it's a visual sight for the eyes, even if you're not in the active role-playing part, even if you're just there in costume, it's seeing people dressed head to toe as goblins and orcs and it's so different, and it's quite liberating, really.
Sounds fantastic. Thank you. Great discussions. I could potentially actually have these as two separate sessions, couldn't I? Which maybe people would find a little bit easier to rewatch, because it could literally just be the culture stuff and then the LARPing stuff.
But again, that they kind of mix, because you've got LARPing culture. So when I did my dissertation, my dissertation at university was on live role playing as a subculture.
Yes,
because
exactly.
Again, it was that cultural difference. So even though it's not a different country, you're still experiencing cultural differences in that activity. So it is kind of connected, but you could definitely do two separates.
And that's the thing, we talked about being autistic in different cultures that are established, autistic as a culture, and LARPing with its own subcultures. Yes. And seeing autistic people as a cultural minority. So thank you very much. And as we always finish on, my favourite question: what is your favourite Stim?
Well, I've been thinking about this one a lot, because I have Stims that I do all the time. So I quite often I'm always stroking my hands or my legs or shaking my legs, but they're not my favorite stim. I'd quite happily stop doing them if I could, but I do them all the time. But for me, it's vocal, it's singing. I like to try, even if it's the same song all day, I will keep trying to sing it until my voice matches the exact noise that the singer's making. So I like doing really deep songs. I love singing Rawhide, you know, and yeah, it's making noises and not always just singing. When I was young, I can remember I worked in an office and I wound everyone up. I didn't know they had these headsets like this one where you've got one ear and it's all connected to the internal phone thing. I didn't realize that every time they hung up for that split second, that all the lines were open. And after about a week of me working there, the manageress came down saying, there's been complaints. We need to know who the hell is clucking. Because whenever I was in between calls, because there was so much noise in the open plan office, I couldn't think straight. It was so overwhelming. So I'd make my own noise to compensate. And I'd literally sit there just making chicken noises. And I do that without even thinking about it. So for me, it's making noise to cover other noise or to try and mimic noise. So either I'm trying to copy animals or I'm trying to copy someone's singing voice, and I can't sing, so it takes me forever to even come close. But those are my favorite stims.
Fantastic. I love it because everyone's are so different, and sometimes it's tactile, sometimes it's auditory, or like you say, making sounds yourself and things. So I do like asking because everyone's always slightly different, and even different senses, which I do like asking about. And on the topic of senses, lovely people, so next week we have Annette and Monique, and we are going to be doing, I guess, like an introductory session about sensory differences and stimming, and hopefully I think both Annette both Annette and Monique will talk about different ways of relaxing, so relaxation techniques in relation to sensory and stimming. And then the week after that, that's when we've actually got Emma Reardon as well, who's going to be talking about sorry. The comments back on screen. So the following week will be Emma Reardon, who will then be talking about the importance of understanding sensory trauma. So I feel like this is quite a good couple of sessions dedicated to sensory and stimming. And Victoria's like, no, please no. Okay, the question is, come on, Si, there we go. Mayonnaise or salad cream, and why mayonnaise?
Definitely mayonnaise with salads, but salad cream with lasagna.
Nice.
So I'm definitely a mayonnaise person most of the time.
Sad times. There you go, Si. One for the team, for you.
Sorry, Chloe.
No, that's fine, because it just means more salad cream for me. That's fine for me. So thank you, Monique, for being here. Stay on even past the credits, so we can just catch up. And so thank you, everybody, for being here, and we will see you next week when we're talking about stimming and sensory. Bye, everybody.